The summer heat in Sunset Valley, Montana was unforgiving that July afternoon when Will Harrison stood in his kitchen, staring at yet another resignation letter. Mrs. Parsons, his third housekeeper in 6 months, had written her notice in careful cursive, citing the boy's behavior as her primary reason for leaving. Will crumpled the paper in his weathered hands and tossed it toward the overflowing trash can, missing by several inches. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Through the window, he could see his two sons in the backyard. Tommy, 12 years old and all elbows in defiance, was throwing rocks at the old oak tree with unnecessary violence. 8-year-old Jake sat in the dirt nearby, silently arranging sticks in perfect geometric patterns, lost in his own quiet world. Neither boy had spoken more than a few words to him at breakfast, and Will felt the familiar weight of failure settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The Horseshoe Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Montana cattle country, generating enough income to secure his family's future for generations. Black Angus cattle dotted the rolling hills like scattered dominoes, and the ranch house itself was a monument to 4 generations of Harrison prosperity. But all the money in the world couldn't buy him what he needed most: someone who could reach his boys. Someone who could mend the fabric of their fractured family life. Maggie had been gone 2 years now, claimed by cancer at 38, and Will still felt like he was drowning in the aftermath. The boys needed more than he could give them. Tommy's anger manifested in broken dishes, torn clothing, and a string of behavioral incidents at Mountain View Elementary. Jake had retreated so far into himself that some days Will wondered if his younger son remembered how to speak at all. They needed a woman's touch, someone who could sew their torn lives back together with the kind of patience and skill that seemed to come naturally to mothers. The irony wasn't lost on him that in a house full of ripped jeans, torn shirts, and unraveling seams, he couldn't find anyone willing to take on the job of keeping his family stitched together. Catherine Mitchell had been driving for 3 days straight when her battered Honda Civic finally wheezed into the town of Cedar Falls, Montana. The car's air conditioning had given up somewhere outside Billings, and her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with perspiration. She pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, her hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and caffeine withdrawal. The help wanted section of the Cedar Falls Gazette lay folded on the passenger seat, circled advertisements marking her dwindling options. Most required references she couldn't provide, experience she'd lost, or a stability she no longer possessed. But one advertisement had caught her attention that morning, written in what appeared to be a man's hasty handwriting: seamstress and housekeeper needed for widowed rancher and 2 boys. Room and board provided. Must be patient with children. Call Harrison Ranch. Kate had stared at those words for a long time. The irony was bitter and sharp. 2 years ago, she'd been Catherine Mitchell Designs, creating custom wedding gowns for Chicago's elite, her studio booked solid for 18 months in advance. Brides flew in from across the country to wear her creations, each dress a masterpiece of silk, lace, and dreams made tangible. She'd had a waiting list, a thriving business, and a husband she adored. Now she was 38 years old, nearly broke, and seeking work as a housekeeper in rural Montana. The wedding dress business had died with David, her husband and business partner, killed in a senseless car accident 14 months ago. The grief had paralyzed her creativity for months, and by the time she'd tried to resurrect her business, her clients had moved on to other designers. The life insurance had barely covered David's medical bills and funeral expenses. The studio lease had expired. The dream was over. Kate wiped her eyes and picked up her phone, dialing the number from the advertisement. A man answered on the 3rd ring, his voice deep and gravelly. Harrison Ranch. I'm calling about the position advertised in the paper. The seamstress and housekeeper job. There was a pause, and Kate could hear children's voices in the background, one of them shouting something she couldn't make out. You have experience with children? The man asked, and Kate detected a note of desperation beneath his gruff exterior. Some, she said carefully. It wasn't entirely a lie. She'd helped her sister with her 3 kids during visits, though that hardly qualified her to manage a ranch household. Can you start immediately? The urgency in his voice surprised her. I suppose so. I'm actually in Cedar Falls right now. How soon can you be here? Kate looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her mascara had smudged in the heat, her blouse was wrinkled from days of driving, and she looked every bit like a woman fleeing her old life. But the desperation in the rancher's voice matched her own. "Give me your address. I can be there in an hour." The drive to Horseshoe Ranch took Kate through some of the most beautiful country she'd ever seen. Rolling hills stretched toward snow-capped mountains in the distance, and cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that seemed to extend forever. The ranch entrance was marked by a massive wooden sign carved with a horseshoe and the Harrison name, mounted between two stone pillars that spoke of old money and established tradition. The main house appeared after a quarter-mile drive down a gravel road lined with towering cottonwoods. It was a sprawling log structure that managed to look both rustic and elegant, with a wide wraparound porch and flower boxes that had clearly been neglected for some time. Kate parked next to a dusty pickup truck and gathered her courage before walking to the front door. Will Harrison answered her knock, and Kate felt her breath catch slightly. He was tall, probably 6'3", with dark hair beginning to show silver at the temples and the kind of weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His blue eyes held a wariness that she recognized, the guarded look of someone who'd been hurt and wasn't eager to risk it again. He wore a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked by old scars and permanent tan lines. "Mrs. Mitchell?" he asked, his gaze taking in her travel-worn appearance without judgment. "Kate, please." And preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Yes, I'm here about the position." He nodded and stepped aside to let her enter. The interior of the house was beautiful but clearly suffered from a lack of feminine attention. The furniture was expensive but showed signs of rough use. Throw pillows were scattered haphazardly, and Kate could see dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through unwashed windows. "Coffee," Will offered, leading her toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "That would be wonderful, thank you." The kitchen was the heart of the house, with granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and a breakfast nook that looked out over the ranch's main pasture. But like the rest of the house, it bore the signs of a household without a woman's organizing touch. Dishes were clean but stacked randomly, the pantry door hung slightly ajar, and she could see children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator with an assortment of mismatched magnets. Will poured coffee into two mismatched mugs and gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table. "I should probably explain the situation before we go any further." Kate nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm mug and waiting for him to continue. "My wife passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. Since then, I've had 3 housekeepers quit, 2 nannies who lasted less than a month each, and Mrs. Parsons just gave her notice this morning." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that Kate suspected was habitual when he was stressed. "The boys are having a hard time adjusting. Tommy's angry at the world, and Jake hasn't spoken more than a few sentences since the funeral." The raw honesty in his voice touched something in Kate's chest. She recognized the particular exhaustion that came from trying to hold a family together when you felt like you were falling apart yourself. "How old are they?" she asked softly. "Tommy's 12, Jake's 8. They're good kids, but they've been through hell, and I'm not sure I'm doing right by them." Will's voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Kate felt her professional reserve beginning to crumble. "What exactly would you need from me?" "Someone who can keep the house running, do the cooking and cleaning, but more than that. Someone who can be patient with them, help them with their schoolwork when fall comes, maybe teach them some life skills. Tommy's growing out of his clothes faster than I can replace them, and half of what he owns has holes in it. Jake won't let anyone but me help him get dressed in the morning, but I travel sometimes for cattle sales and business." Kate felt a familiar pang at the mention of children's clothing. She'd spent her career creating dreams for brides, but some of her favorite projects had been the flower girl dresses and ring-bearer outfits that accompanied the weddings. The seamstress part of the job would involve keeping up with their clothes, alterations and repairs, among other things. The advertisement probably made it sound more formal than it is. "I just need someone who can sew, who can keep this place running, and who won't give up on my boys when things get difficult." The vulnerability in his admission hit Kate square in the chest. This wasn't just about household management or child care. This was about a father desperately trying to save his sons from drowning in their grief. "What happened to the other housekeepers?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Will's jaw tightened. Tommy has a temper. He's broken 3 of Mrs. Henderson's favorite dishes, hidden Mrs. Patterson's car keys twice, and told Mrs. Parsons that he wished she would die like his mother did. Kate winced, but didn't comment. She'd seen enough grieving children to know that anger was often easier to express than sadness. Jake doesn't eat what anyone but me prepares, won't talk to strangers, and has panic attacks if he can't find me when he wakes up from nightmares. The picture Will painted was of 2 boys lost in trauma, acting out in the only ways they knew how. It would take patience, consistency, and probably a thick skin to help them heal. I should probably meet them before we discuss terms, Kate said. Will nodded, relief evident in his expression. They're out back. Fair warning though, they're not likely to be welcoming at first. He led her through a mudroom lined with boots, jackets, and what appeared to be an impressive collection of baseball caps, then out onto a back porch that overlooked the ranch's main yard. Kate could see the 2 boys Will had described. Tommy was still throwing rocks, his throws becoming increasingly violent, while Jake continued his silent arrangement of sticks and leaves. Boys, Will called. Come here for a minute. Tommy looked up with an expression of immediate suspicion, while Jake glanced toward them but made no move to approach. After a moment, Tommy grabbed his brother's arm and pulled him across the yard. This is Mrs. Mitchell, Will said when they reached the porch. She might be coming to help out around here. Tommy looked Kate up and down with the assessing gaze of someone much older than 12. His dark hair was too long and fell into eyes that were exactly like his father's, though currently filled with hostility rather than wariness. We don't need help, Tommy announced. We're fine on our own. Jake said nothing, but he moved slightly behind his older brother, using Tommy as a shield between himself and the stranger. Kate crouched down to bring herself closer to their eye level, a gesture that surprised both boys. Most adults remained standing when addressing children, maintaining their physical advantage. Hi Tommy. Hi Jake. I'm Kate. Your dad mentioned that you might be able to use some help around here, especially with clothes and cooking. Tommy's expression didn't soften. Are you another nanny? Because we don't need one. We're not babies. I'm not a nanny, Kate said honestly. I'm someone who knows how to sew and cook, and I need a place to live for a while. Your dad has a place that needs someone to take care of it. It seems like maybe we could help each other out. The honesty seemed to catch Tommy off guard. He'd clearly been prepared for adult platitudes and false cheer, not straightforward negotiation. What do you know about ranching? He challenged. Absolutely nothing, Kate admitted. I'm from Chicago. I know about as much about cattle as you probably know about designing wedding dresses. Despite himself, Tommy's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. That's pretty stupid then. Coming to work on a ranch when you don't know anything about it. Tommy Will warned, but Kate held up a hand. He's right. It is pretty stupid. But sometimes when your old life doesn't work anymore, you have to be willing to try something completely different, even if you don't know what you're doing at first. Something in her tone must have resonated with the boy, because his hostile expression softened slightly. Jake peeked around his brother's shoulder, studying Kate with curious eyes. Can you really sew? Tommy asked. Kate reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the photos until she found some of her work. She held it out so both boys could see the screen. I used to make wedding dresses for people in Chicago. See this one with all the lace? That took me 3 weeks to finish. And this one had over 200 tiny pearls that I sewed on by hand. Both boys stared at the elaborate gowns, clearly impressed despite themselves. Jake pointed at one particularly ornate dress and whispered something to Tommy. Jake wants to know if you made that one for a princess. Tommy translated. Kate smiled. Not a real princess, but the bride felt like one when she wore it. That's kind of the point of a really beautiful dress. Could you fix clothes too? Tommy asked. Like if something got torn or had holes in it. I could probably fix just about anything that's wrong with clothes. Tears, holes, buttons, zippers, hems that are too long or too short. Tommy glanced at his father, then back at Kate. My favorite shirt has a big rip in the sleeve. Dad said we'd have to throw it away. I'd be happy to take a look at it. Sometimes things that seem too broken to fix just need someone who knows the right technique. The metaphor wasn't lost on Will, who was watching the interaction with growing amazement. In 5 minutes, Kate had accomplished more with his sons than the last 3 housekeepers combined. Jake doesn't talk to strangers, Tommy said, moving protectively closer to his younger brother. That's okay, Kate replied. I talk enough for 3 people anyway. My husband used to say I could have entire conversations by myself. Where is your husband? Tommy asked with the directness that only children possessed. Kate felt the familiar stab of pain but managed to keep her voice steady. He died in a car accident. That's part of why I'm here looking for a new place to live. The simple honesty seemed to break through Tommy's defenses completely. His expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching sympathy. Our mom died too, he said quietly. Cancer. I'm sorry, Kate said simply. That's really hard. Tommy nodded, then looked at Jake. He doesn't eat food that other people make. Only Dad's cooking. Well, that makes sense. When you're scared or sad, familiar things feel safer than new things. Are you scared? Tommy asked. Kate considered the question seriously. A little bit, yes. Starting over somewhere new is scary. But sometimes scary things turn out to be exactly what you need. Jake tugged on Tommy's sleeve and whispered something urgently in his ear. Tommy nodded and looked back at Kate. Jake wants to know if you'll really stay, or if you'll leave like the others did. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of repeated abandonment. Kate looked at Jake's small face, at the hope and fear warring in his expression, and felt something shift in her chest. I can't promise that everything will work out perfectly, she said carefully. But I can promise that if I take this job, I won't leave just because things get difficult or because someone has a bad day. Will felt something loosen in his chest at her words. The careful way she spoke to his boys. The respect she showed for their intelligence and their pain. It was more than he dared to hope for. Why don't we try it for a week? Kate suggested, looking between Will and the boys. That way everyone can see how it works out before making any big decisions. Tommy looked at his father. What do you think, Dad? Will met Kate's eyes over his sons' heads. I think that sounds like a good plan. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the mountains, Kate found herself being given a tour of the house by Tommy, with Jake trailing silently behind them. The guest room that would be hers was on the main floor, connected to the kitchen by a short hallway. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with its own bathroom and windows that looked out over the ranch's main pasture. Mrs. Parsons slept here, Tommy informed her. But she snored really loud and always left the bathroom messy. Kate nodded seriously. I'll try to do better on both counts. The boys' rooms were upstairs, along with Will's master suite and what had clearly been designed as a family room or playroom. Tommy's room was a disaster of sports equipment, books, and clothes, while Jake's was meticulously organized, every toy and book in its precise place. Jake likes things neat, Tommy explained when he saw Kate looking around his brother's room. He gets upset if anything gets moved. Kate filed away this information along with everything else she was learning about the family dynamics. Jake's need for order was likely his way of maintaining control in a world that had become unpredictable and frightening. By dinner time, Kate had been integrated into the household routine with surprising ease. She helped Will prepare a simple meal of grilled chicken and vegetables, noting that both boys ate without complaint, and that Jake even made eye contact with her several times during the meal. Tomorrow we can discuss salary and formal arrangements, Will said as Kate helped clear the dishes. Tonight, why don't you just settle in and see how you feel about the place? Kate nodded, suddenly exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day. That sounds perfect. As she unpacked her few belongings in the guest room, Kate reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. This morning she'd been a desperate woman fleeing a failed life in Chicago. Tonight she was the potential salvation of a grieving family in Montana, preparing to take on responsibilities she'd never imagined. Through her window, she could see Will and the boys on the back porch, the three of them silhouetted against the setting sun. Tommy was actually talking animatedly about something, his earlier hostility replaced by what looked like cautious optimism. Jake sat close to his father, still quiet but no longer withdrawn. For the first time in months, Kate felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Perhaps her talent for mending things extended beyond torn fabric and broken seams. Perhaps here, in this beautiful and broken place, she could learn to sew together more than just clothing. Perhaps she could help heal a family, and in doing so begin to heal herself. Kate woke to the sound of boots on hardwood floors and muffled voices drifting through her bedroom door. The digital clock on the nightstand read 5:30 in the morning, and pale dawn light was just beginning to filter through the curtains. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the unfamiliar sounds and smells of ranch life. Coffee was brewing somewhere in the house, and she could hear Will's deep voice giving what sounded like instructions to someone. She dressed quickly in jeans and a simple cotton blouse, then ventured out to find the source of the activity. The kitchen was bustling with quiet efficiency. Will stood at the counter packing what appeared to be lunch into a cooler, while two men in work clothes sat at the breakfast table with steaming mugs of coffee. "Morning," Will said when he noticed her. "Coffee's fresh. These are my ranch hands, Pete and Miguel. They help with the cattle operations." The two men nodded politely, before returning to their quiet conversation about fence repairs and cattle rotation. Kate poured herself a cup of coffee and watched Will work, noting the practiced efficiency of his movements. This was clearly a well-established morning routine. "What time do the boys usually get up?" she asked quietly. "School days, around 7. Summer schedule is more flexible, but they're usually awake by 8. Will glanced at the clock. "Today's Saturday, so they'll probably sleep late." Pete and Miguel finished their coffee and headed outside, their voices fading as they walked toward the barn. The sudden quiet in the kitchen felt intimate and slightly awkward. "I should probably explain the household routine," Will said, leaning against the counter. Mrs. Parsons had the boys eating breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, laundry on Wednesday and Saturdays. She did most of the cooking, though the boys are pretty particular about what they'll eat. Kate nodded, filing away the information. "What about their daily activities? Chores, entertainment, that sort of thing?" "Tommy's supposed to keep his room clean and help with feeding the horses. Jake's responsibility is collecting eggs from the chickens, though he needs supervision. Neither of them has been very consistent about it lately." Will's expression darkened slightly. "I've been picking up the slack, but I can't be everywhere at once." "What happens when you travel for business?" "I've been turning down most trips since Maggie died. The boys don't do well when I'm gone, and the housekeepers couldn't handle them alone." He paused, studying her face. "If this arrangement works out, I'd like to gradually return to a more normal travel schedule. There are cattle auctions and breeding conferences that are important for the ranch's success." The weight of responsibility settling on Kate's shoulders felt both daunting and oddly comforting. It had been a long time since anyone had depended on her for anything significant. "What about their clothes situation? You mentioned that was part of the job." Will's expression turned almost embarrassed. "Come see for yourself." He led her upstairs to Tommy's room, which looked even more chaotic in the morning light. Clothes were scattered across every surface, and when Will opened the closet door, Kate could see why. Half the hanging garments had tears, missing buttons or stains that looked permanent. The dresser drawers were stuffed so full they wouldn't close properly. "He's growing so fast I can barely keep up with buying new things, and he's rough on everything he owns. Sports, climbing trees, helping with ranch work when I let him." Will picked up a shirt with a sleeve that was completely detached at the shoulder seam. This was new 6 weeks ago. Kate examined the damaged shirt, her fingers automatically assessing the tear. "This is completely fixable. The fabric isn't damaged, just the seam. 20 minutes with a sewing machine, and it'll be good as new." "You really think so?" "I know so." Kate moved to the dresser and began sorting through the contents of one drawer. Nearly everything needed some kind of attention. Hems that were too short, tears that had been ignored until they became gaping holes, missing buttons that had never been replaced. Will, this is my specialty. I've been repairing and altering clothes my entire adult life. Relief flooded his features. Mrs. Parsons just kept making lists of things that needed to be thrown away and replaced. It was getting expensive, and Tommy was getting frustrated because his favorite pieces kept disappearing. They moved to Jake's room next, which presented a different set of challenges. While his clothes were neatly organized, many items were clearly too small. Unlike his brother, Jake seemed to avoid activities that might damage his clothing, but he'd outgrown nearly everything he owned. He won't wear anything that doesn't fit perfectly, Will explained. If a sleeve is too short or pants are too tight, he'll have a complete meltdown. But he also won't wear anything new until it's been washed multiple times and feels familiar. Kate understood the dilemma immediately. Jake needed clothes that fit properly, but the process of transitioning to new garments was complicated by his need for familiarity and routine. What if we altered his existing clothes to fit better, and gradually introduced new pieces that were pre-washed and similar to things he already likes? You could do that. Absolutely. Letting out seams, lengthening hems, adjusting waistbands. It's all basic tailoring work. Kate examined a pair of Jake's pants that were clearly several inches too short. These could easily be lengthened if we added a coordinating fabric at the hem. He might even like the contrast. Will looked like she just offered to solve world hunger. Mrs. Parsons said all of this was too complicated, that we should just buy new clothes and force the boys to adapt. That might work for some children, but not for kids dealing with trauma. Familiar textures and fits can be very comforting when everything else feels uncertain. As they headed back downstairs, Kate heard sounds coming from the kitchen. Tommy appeared to be making breakfast, based on the clattering of pans and the smell of toast. When they entered the kitchen, they found him standing at the stove with a spatula in hand, concentrating intensely on what appeared to be scrambled eggs. "Morning, Dad," Tommy said without looking up. "Jake's still sleeping, but I figured I'd make breakfast." "That's thoughtful of you," Will replied, though Kate noticed the slight tension in his voice. Kate watched Tommy work, noting his confidence with the cooking process. The eggs looked perfectly fluffy, and he'd clearly done this before. "That smells wonderful, Tommy. You're quite the cook." Tommy glanced at her, a flush of pride coloring his cheeks. "Mom taught me before she got too sick. She said every person should know how to feed themselves." The casual mention of his mother caught Kate off guard, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. She was absolutely right. Cooking is one of the most important life skills anyone can learn. "Mrs. Parsons never let me cook. She said kids would just make a mess." Well, Mrs. Parsons wasn't here to enjoy these excellent eggs. Kate said diplomatically. "Mind if I make some toast to go with them?" Tommy nodded, moving aside to give her access to the toaster. As they worked together in the kitchen, Kate felt some of the boy's wariness beginning to dissolve. He was clearly starved for adult approval and the opportunity to demonstrate his competence. Jake appeared in the doorway as they were setting the table, his hair standing up in multiple directions, and his pajamas wrinkled from sleep. He took in the scene of Kate and Tommy working together, his expression unreadable. "Morning, buddy," Will said, ruffling his younger son's hair. Tommy made breakfast. Jake nodded and took his usual seat at the table, but Kate noticed he was watching her carefully. When she placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, he stared at it for a long moment before taking a tentative bite. "These are really good, Tommy," Kate said, after tasting the eggs. "You've got natural talent." Tommy beamed, and even Jake seemed to relax slightly as he continued eating. After breakfast, Will announced that he needed to check on the cattle in the north pasture and would be gone for several hours. Kate felt a flutter of nervousness at being left alone with the boys so soon, but she kept her expression calm. "What do you guys usually do on Saturday mornings?" she asked after Will had left. Tommy shrugged. "Nothing much. Watch TV, play video games. Mrs. Parsons used to make us clean our rooms, but we didn't have to do anything fun." The dismissive way he said fun told Kate everything she needed to know about the previous housekeeper's approach to childcare. "What would you like to do?" The question seemed to surprise both boys. They exchanged glances, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of test. "We could show you around the ranch," Tommy offered tentatively. "If you want to learn about it, I mean. Since you said you don't know anything about cattle." "I would love that," Kate said sincerely. "But first, could you help me with something? I'd like to set up a sewing area somewhere in the house, and I need to figure out where would work best." Tommy's eyes lit up with interest. "What kind of sewing stuff?" "I have a sewing machine in my car, along with some basic supplies. I was thinking I could start working on some of those clothes repairs we talked about." Jake perked up at this, though he remained silent. "There's a room off the kitchen that Mom used for crafts and stuff," Tommy said. "It's got a big table and good light. Mrs. Parsons just used it for storage." They trooped through the house to a room Kate hadn't seen during her initial tour. It was perfect for her needs. A large sunny space with built-in shelving, electrical outlets in convenient locations, and a beautiful antique table that would work perfectly for cutting fabric. "This is ideal," Kate said, already envisioning how she would organize the space. "Would you boys be willing to help me bring my things in from the car?" The next hour was spent transforming the craft room into a functional sewing studio. Tommy proved to be an excellent helper, carrying boxes and asking intelligent questions about Kate's equipment. Jake watched from the doorway, clearly interested but maintaining his distance. When Kate plugged in her sewing machine and turned it on for the first time in months, both boys jumped at the unfamiliar sound. "It's loud," Tommy observed. "Most sewing machines are. But you get used to it." Kate threaded the machine with practiced efficiency. "Want to see how it works?" She demonstrated with a scrap of fabric, showing how the needle moved up and down to create perfectly straight stitches. Both boys were fascinated, and Jake actually stepped closer to get a better view. "Could you teach us how to use it?" Tommy asked. "Absolutely, if you're interested. There are lots of useful things you can make with a sewing machine. Bags, pillows, simple clothes alterations." Jake tugged on Tommy's sleeve and whispered something urgently. "Jake wants to know if you could fix his stuffed elephant," Tommy translated. "Its ear is coming off and he's worried it'll fall off completely." Kate's heart melted a little. "Of course I can fix it. Would he like to watch while I do it?" Jake nodded shyly and disappeared upstairs, returning moments later with a well-loved gray elephant that had clearly been a constant companion for years. One ear was indeed hanging by a few threads, and the fabric was worn soft from countless hugs. "This is a very special elephant," Kate said seriously, examining the damage. "He's been very well loved." Jake nodded again, his eyes never leaving the stuffed animal. Kate positioned the elephant on her work table and carefully assessed the repair needed. The ear could be reattached, but it would require hand stitching for durability. She selected a thread that matched the elephant's gray fabric, and began working with small, precise stitches. Both boys watched in fascination as she worked, asking questions about the technique and the thread choice. Jake remained silent, but he moved closer and closer until he was standing right beside her chair, close enough that she could feel his small body's warmth. "There," Kate said finally, holding up the elephant. "Good as new." Jake's face transformed with relief and joy. He reached for the elephant, hugging it tightly before looking up at Kate with an expression of pure gratitude. "What do you say, Jake?" Tommy prompted gently. Jake opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Thank you," he whispered so quietly. Kate almost missed it. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to her, and the moment felt monumentally significant. Kate felt tears prick her eyes but managed to keep her voice steady. "You're very welcome, Jake. I'm glad I could help." The rest of the morning flew by as Kate began working on Tommy's damaged shirts while the boys took turns giving her detailed explanations of ranch operations. Tommy proved to be remarkably knowledgeable about cattle breeding, feed management, and seasonal ranch activities. Jake chimed in occasionally with soft-spoken additions or corrections, gradually becoming more comfortable with speaking in Kate's presence. When Will returned from the north pasture around noon, he found the three of them in the kitchen preparing lunch together. Tommy was teaching Kate how to make his mother's recipe for grilled cheese sandwiches, while Jake carefully arranged carrot sticks on a plate with geometric precision. How did everything go? Will asked, though the relaxed atmosphere in the kitchen provided its own answer. Kate fixed my elephant, Jake announced, the longest sentence he'd spoken in Will's presence for weeks. Will's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. Did she now? That's wonderful, buddy. And she showed us how her sewing machine works. Tommy added, she's going to teach us how to use it. She fixed 3 of my shirts already. Tommy continued. They look brand new. Will examined the shirts Kate had repaired. His amazement evident. The work was flawless, completely invisible except for the fact that the garments were now functional again. This is incredible work, Kate. I can't thank you enough. It's what I love doing, Kate replied simply. And the boys were excellent helpers. Over lunch, Will seemed to study the dynamic between Kate and his sons with growing wonder. The boys were more animated than he'd seen them in months, and Jake was actually participating in the conversation instead of sitting in withdrawn silence. Dad, can Kate stay for more than a week? Tommy asked suddenly. I mean, if she wants to. The direct question caught both adults off guard. Will looked at Kate, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. What do you think, Kate? How are you feeling about the arrangement so far? Kate looked around the table at the 3 faces watching her expectantly. 24 hours ago, she'd been a desperate woman with nowhere to go and no clear future. Now she was sitting in a beautiful ranch kitchen, with a family that seemed to genuinely want her there, doing work that utilized her skills and gave her purpose. I think, she said carefully, that we make a pretty good team. If you're willing to have me, I'd like to stay longer than a week. The relief on Will's face was immediate and profound. Are you sure? I know this is a big change from your life in Chicago. Sometimes big changes are exactly what we need, Kate said, echoing her words from the previous day. Tommy whooped with delight, and Jake actually smiled broadly, his whole face lighting up with happiness. There's just one thing, Kate continued. I'd like to be completely honest with you about my background. There are some things I haven't told you. Will's expression grew serious. What kind of things? Kate took a deep breath. My business in Chicago wasn't just any seamstress shop. I was Catherine Mitchell Designs. I created custom wedding gowns for some very high-profile clients. My husband David was my business partner, and when he died, everything fell apart. She waited for shock or judgment, but Will just nodded thoughtfully. That explains the incredible quality of your work. But it doesn't change anything from my perspective. You're here now, and you're exactly what my boys need. There's more, Kate continued. The reason my business failed after David's death wasn't just grief. There were financial complications, legal issues with some contracts. I'm not running from anything criminal, she added quickly, but I am essentially starting over from nothing. Kate, Will said gently. I don't care about your past business complications. What I care about is that my sons are happier today than they've been in 2 years. Whatever brought you here, I'm grateful for it. Tommy and Jake had been listening to this exchange with rapt attention, and Kate could see questions forming in Tommy's expression. Can we see pictures of the fancy dresses you made? Tommy asked. Kate pulled out her phone and showed them more of her portfolio. Both boys were fascinated by the elaborate gowns, asking questions about techniques and materials. This one looks like a princess dress from a movie, Jake said softly, pointing to a particularly ornate creation. The bride said the same thing, Kate told him. She felt like royalty wearing it. Could you make regular clothes too? Tommy asked. Like shirts and pants? Absolutely. Wedding dresses are actually much more complicated than everyday clothing. As the afternoon wore on, Kate found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. She spent time mending more of the boys' clothes while they played outside, and she began planning how to tackle Jake's wardrobe alterations. When Will suggested a tour of the ranch property, she accepted eagerly. The Horseshoe Ranch was even more impressive than she'd realized. 15,000 acres of rolling pasture stretched toward the mountains, with the main cattle herd grazing peacefully in the distance. Will explained the seasonal rotation system, the breeding program, and the business side of cattle ranching with obvious pride and expertise. It's been in my family for 4 generations, he said, as they stood on a hill overlooking the main pasture. My great-grandfather started with 500 acres and big dreams. It's beautiful, Kate said, meaning it. The vastness of the landscape was both humbling and inspiring. Maggie loved this view, Will said quietly. She used to bring the boys up here for picnics when they were little. Kate noticed the way his voice softened when he mentioned his late wife. But there was less raw pain in it than there had been the day before. Perhaps talking about happier memories was becoming easier for him. Tommy and Jake had been exploring on their own during the ranch tour, but they rejoined the adults as the sun began to set. Both boys were dirty, happy, and tired in the way that suggested a day well spent. "What's for dinner?" Tommy asked. "Can Kate cook with us again?" The assumption that she would be included in the evening routine warmed Kate's heart. "What would you like to make?" "Tacos," both boys said simultaneously, then looked at each other and grinned. "Tacos, it is," Will agreed. "I'll show Kate where everything is." The evening passed in a haze of easy domesticity. Kate learned the family's taco-making system, with each person responsible for different components. Tommy handled the ground beef. Jake carefully arranged toppings in small bowls. Will warmed tortillas, and Kate chopped vegetables with the precision of someone trained in knife skills. During dinner, the conversation flowed naturally between ranch business, the boys' upcoming school year, and Kate's stories about some of her more challenging bridal clients. Both boys seemed fascinated by her tales of bridezillas and elaborate wedding demands. "Did you ever make a dress for someone famous?" Tommy asked. "A few people you might recognize, but I never tell names. Client confidentiality is very important in custom work." "That's so cool," Tommy said with obvious admiration. As they cleaned up after dinner, Kate realized how seamlessly she'd been integrated into the family routine. The boys accepted her help naturally, and Will moved around her in the kitchen as if they'd been cooking together for years rather than days. When it came time for the boys to get ready for bed, Kate excused herself to her room to give the family their private time together. But as she was organizing her sewing supplies, a soft knock on her door interrupted her work. "Come in," she called. Jake peered around the door, still clutching his newly repaired elephant. "Kate, what is it, sweetie? Will you still be here tomorrow?" The question, asked with such vulnerable hope, made Kate's chest tight with emotion. "Yes, Jake, I'll be here tomorrow." He nodded solemnly, then surprised her by stepping into the room. "Thank you for fixing Elephant." "You're very welcome. Does Elephant have a name?" Jake shook his head. "He's just Elephant." Kate smiled. Sometimes the simple names are the best ones. Jake lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, as if there was something else he wanted to say. Finally, he whispered, "I'm glad you came here." Before Kate could respond, he disappeared down the hallway toward his room. Kate sat in her chair for a long moment, overwhelmed by the simple sincerity of his words. When Will knocked on her door an hour later, she was still processing the emotional weight of the day. "Got a minute?" he asked. Of course. He entered the room but remained standing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I wanted to thank you again for today. I haven't seen the boys this relaxed and happy since before Maggie got sick. They're wonderful kids, Will. They just needed someone to see past their pain to who they really are. Mrs. Parsons kept telling me they were problem children, that their behavior was unacceptable and needed to be corrected." Kate felt a flash of anger toward the previous housekeeper. "There's nothing wrong with those boys that love and patience won't help. They're grieving, not defective." Will's expression softened with gratitude. "I was beginning to wonder if I was failing them completely. If maybe they'd be better off with their grandparents, or in some kind of structured program." "Will, no. They need their father, and they need stability. They need to know that the adults in their lives won't abandon them when things get difficult. Like their mother did," Will said quietly. "Their mother didn't choose to leave them," Kate said firmly. "There's a big difference between death and abandonment, and they need to understand that." They talked for another hour about the boys' needs, their individual personalities, and Kate's observations about their coping mechanisms. Will was an attentive father who clearly loved his sons deeply, but the practical aspects of single parenting had been overwhelming him. "I keep wondering what Maggie would do in various situations," he admitted. "She was so much better with the emotional stuff than I am." "You're doing better than you think," Kate assured him. And you don't have to figure it all out alone anymore. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. But the foundation of partnership was already forming, built on shared concern for the boys and mutual respect. As Will said goodnight and headed to his own room, Kate reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. 2 days ago, she'd been a desperate woman fleeing a failed life. Tonight she was an integral part of a family that needed her skills, her patience, and her presence. For the first time since David's death, Kate felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The third week at Horseshoe Ranch dawned with an unexpected complication. Kate was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard raised voices coming from Will's office. Through the partially open door, she could see him pacing behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his face dark with frustration. "I don't care what the market projections say, Bob. I'm not interested in selling." Will's voice carried clearly across the hallway. "This ranch has been in our family for 4 generations, and it's going to stay that way." Kate tried to focus on scrambling eggs, but the tension in Will's voice was impossible to ignore. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Will's responses becoming increasingly curt. When he finally ended the call, the slam of the phone against its cradle echoed through the house. Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression worried. "Is Dad okay? He sounds mad." "He's just dealing with some business stuff," Kate said diplomatically, though she was curious about what had caused such a strong reaction. "Why don't you wake Jake? Breakfast is almost ready." Will emerged from his office a few minutes later, his jaw tight and his movements sharp with suppressed anger. He accepted the coffee Kate offered him with a distracted nod, but she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly, while the boys were still upstairs. Will glanced toward the office, then back at her. "My brother Bob has some ideas about the ranch's future that don't align with mine." Before Kate could ask for more details, Tommy and Jake clattered down the stairs, their voices loud in the morning stillness. Will seemed to make a conscious effort to shake off his dark mood, engaging with the boys' chatter about their plans for the day. But Kate noticed the tension remained in his shoulders throughout breakfast, and he barely touched his food despite complimenting her cooking. When his phone rang again just as they were finishing the meal, he glanced at the caller ID, and his expression hardened. "I need to take this," he said, already heading back to his office. "Bob, I thought I made myself clear earlier." The office door closed firmly this time, but Kate could still hear the rumble of conversation, though not the specific words. Tommy and Jake seemed oblivious to their father's stress, chattering happily about a fort they were building in the barn. "Can you help us with the fort after chores?" Tommy asked Kate. "We need someone who's good with measuring and making things fit together right." "I'd love to help," Kate said, though her attention was partially focused on the continued conversation from Will's office. The tone had shifted from frustrated to coldly professional, which somehow seemed worse. An hour later, Will finally emerged from his office, his expression grim but controlled. He found Kate in the sewing room, where she was taking in the waist of a pair of Jake's jeans, while he watched with fascination. "Kate, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Jake looked up with concern, but Kate smiled reassuringly at him. "Why don't you go find Tommy? I'll finish these pants later, and we can work on your fort this afternoon." Jake nodded and scampered off, leaving Kate alone with Will. She could see the stress lines around his eyes had deepened, and his usual calm demeanor seemed strained. "I need to be honest with you about something that might affect your position here," Will said without preamble. "My brother Bob is pressuring me to sell the ranch to a development company. They want to turn it into a luxury resort and golf course." Kate felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you considering it?" "Absolutely not. But Bob is my business partner in several ventures, and he's threatening to make things difficult if I don't at least hear their offer." Will ran a hand through his hair. A gesture Kate had learned indicated deep frustration. "The problem is, he's been talking to people in town, suggesting that I'm not capable of making sound business decisions since Maggie died." The implication was clear and ugly. He's questioning your competence. Among other things, he's also implying that my judgment might be compromised by my domestic situation. Will's gaze met hers directly. Meaning you. Kate felt heat rise in her cheeks, part embarrassment and part anger. What exactly is he saying? That a grieving widower might make poor decisions based on loneliness rather than business sense. That hiring an attractive woman with no ranching experience shows questionable judgment. The crude reduction of their professional relationship to some kind of romantic desperation stung more than Kate expected. I want you to know that's not how I see our arrangement at all. Will said quickly, you've been exactly what this family needed, and I won't let Bob's narrow-minded assumptions affect that. Kate appreciated his support, but she could see the position this put him in. If his brother was already stirring up gossip in town, her presence might become a liability rather than an asset. What do you need me to do? She asked simply. Will's expression softened with gratitude. Just continue being yourself. Don't let Bob's politics change anything about how you interact with the boys or run the household. But I wanted you to be aware that things might get complicated over the next few weeks. Before Kate could respond, the sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see a sleek black sedan that looked completely out of place among the ranch's practical trucks and equipment. That'll be Bob, Will said grimly. Right on schedule. Bob Harrison emerged from the sedan wearing an expensive suit that looked ridiculous in the ranch setting. He was younger than Will by several years, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of city living and corporate success. Even from a distance, Kate could see the family resemblance. But where Will's features were weathered and genuine, Bob seemed calculating and smooth. Stay here, Will said, heading toward the front door. Let me handle this. But Kate had no intention of hiding. If Bob Harrison was going to make her employment an issue, she wanted to understand exactly what she was dealing with. She positioned herself where she could observe the conversation without being obvious about it. Bob's arrival seemed to transform the peaceful ranch atmosphere. Tommy and Jake emerged from the barn, their happy chatter dying as they recognized their uncle. Kate noticed that neither boy ran to greet him the way children typically did with beloved relatives. Uncle Bob, Tommy said politely but without enthusiasm. Boys, Bob replied with equal formality. You're looking well. The conversation that followed was stilted and awkward, with Bob making obvious efforts to appear interested in his nephews while clearly being more focused on his business with Will. Kate watched from the window as he kept glancing toward the house, obviously looking for her. Where's this housekeeper I've been hearing about? Bob asked loudly enough for Kate to hear clearly. Kate's working inside, Will replied evenly. She's been a godsend with the boys. I'm sure she has. The skepticism in Bob's tone was unmistakable. I'd like to meet her, assess the situation for myself. Kate made a quick decision. Better to control the introduction than let Bob's imagination run wild. She smoothed her hair, checked her appearance in the hallway mirror, and walked out to meet Will's brother head-on. You must be Bob, she said, extending her hand with professional confidence. I'm Kate Mitchell. I've heard a lot about you. Bob's assessment was immediate and obvious, his gaze taking in everything from her clothes to her posture to the way she positioned herself in relation to Will and the boys. Kate met his scrutiny calmly, having dealt with plenty of judgmental clients in her previous career. Miss Mitchell, Bob said, his handshake firm but brief. I understand you're from Chicago. That's right. I moved here recently to take care of the household and help with the boys. Quite a change from city life, I imagine. What brought you to rural Montana? The question was casual, but Kate recognized the probe for what it was. Bob was fishing for information he could use to support his assumptions about her motives. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. Kate replied diplomatically. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with such a wonderful family. Bob's smile didn't reach his eyes. And what exactly is your background, if you don't mind me asking? Will mentioned you're quite skilled with alterations and such. Kate felt Will tense beside her, but she kept her voice steady. I have extensive experience in clothing design and household management. The boys have been very patient while I learn about ranch life. Clothing design, Bob repeated thoughtfully. Anything I might have heard of. The question was a trap, Kate realized. If she mentioned her successful business, Bob would wonder why she'd left it. If she downplayed her experience, he'd question her qualifications. Either way, he'd find ammunition for his arguments. I specialized in custom work, she said simply. Each project was unique. Before Bob could pursue the topic further, Jake appeared at Kate's side, slipping his small hand into hers with complete trust. The gesture was unconscious and natural, but Kate saw Bob's eyes narrow as he observed it. "Kate's teaching us how to sew," Jake announced, his voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for everyone to hear. "She fixed my elephant and made Tommy's shirts like new." "How nice," Bob said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "I'm sure that's very domestic." The dismissive way he said domestic made Kate's temper flare, but she kept her expression neutral. Tommy, however, had no such restraint. "Kate's really smart," Tommy said defiantly. "She knows how to do lots of stuff that other people can't do. And she makes really good food, and she doesn't yell at us when we mess up." "I'm sure she's very capable," Bob replied smoothly. "But your father and I need to discuss some important business matters. Perhaps we could speak privately, Will?" The dismissal was polite but firm. Kate started to step away, but Will caught her arm gently. "Kate's part of this household," he said calmly. "Anything that affects the ranch affects her and the boys." Bob's expression flickered with surprise and displeasure. "Will, I hardly think domestic arrangements need to be part of our business discussions." "They do when those discussions involve selling the ranch," Will replied evenly. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut. Kate could feel the boys pressing closer to her, sensing the adult conflict even if they didn't understand its specifics. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," Bob suggested, his corporate smile becoming strained. The next hour was one of the most uncomfortable Kate had ever experienced. Bob presented his case for selling the ranch with professional polish, complete with market analysis, development projections, and financial forecasts. The numbers were impressive, Kate had to admit. The offer from Pinnacle Resort Development was substantial enough to set up Will and the boys for life. But with every chart and graph Bob displayed on his laptop, Kate could see Will's resistance hardening. This wasn't just about money for him. It was about legacy, about the land his family had worked for generations, about providing his sons with the same connection to the earth that had shaped him. The boys could have the best education money can buy, Bob argued. Private schools, Ivy League universities, opportunities that ranch life simply can't provide. The boys are getting exactly the education they need right here, Will countered. They're learning responsibility, hard work, connection to the land. Those are values you can't buy. Values don't pay for college tuition or medical emergencies, Bob shot back. Be practical, Will. You're one bad year away from serious financial trouble. Kate noticed that Bob kept glancing at her during these exchanges, as if gauging her reaction to the financial discussions. She maintained careful neutrality, but internally she was processing the implications of what she was hearing. If the ranch was truly in precarious financial condition, her salary was an additional burden Will couldn't afford. The thought of being an unwitting drain on a struggling family made her stomach clench with guilt. "The ranch has weathered bad years before," Will said firmly. "We'll manage whatever comes. Not with the overhead you're carrying now." Bob replied pointedly. Additional household staff, increased domestic expenses, new financial obligations. The indirect reference to Kate's employment hung in the air like an accusation. She felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized Bob was essentially arguing that Will couldn't afford her. "My domestic arrangements are not your concern," Will said coldly. "They are when they affect your ability to make sound business decisions," Bob countered. "Will, I know you've been lonely since Maggie died. We all understand that. But hiring attractive housekeepers isn't the solution to grief." The crude reduction of Kate's role to some kind of paid companionship was too much. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I think I should check on the boys," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. But as she reached the door, Bob's voice stopped her. Miss Mitchell, since you're here, perhaps you could share your perspective on the ranch's future. After all, your employment would be affected by any changes. Kate turned slowly, recognizing the trap but unwilling to run from it. My perspective is that this is a family decision that should be made, based on what's best for Tommy and Jake, not on financial projections or development opportunities. And you don't think financial security is what's best for them. I think stability and continuity are what's best for them. They've already lost their mother. Taking away their home and their father's life work would be another devastating loss. Bob's expression sharpened with interest. You seem very invested in this family's welfare for someone who's been here such a short time. The implication was clear and ugly. Kate felt Will tense beside her, but she kept her focus on Bob. I'm invested in doing my job well and supporting the people who've given me an opportunity when I needed one most. How refreshing to see such loyalty, Bob said with false warmth. Though one has to wonder about the sustainability of such arrangements when financial pressures mount. Kate understood the threat implicit in his words. If the ranch faced financial difficulties, she would be among the first expenses to be cut. The message was clear, her presence was precarious, dependent on Will's continued ability to afford her services. I think we've covered enough ground for today, Will said, rising from his chair with obvious finality. I'll consider your proposal, Bob, but my position hasn't changed. Bob gathered his papers with professional efficiency, but Kate could see his frustration with the meeting's outcome. He'd expected to convince Will with financial arguments, and the resistance he'd encountered clearly surprised him. Don't take too long to decide, Bob said as he prepared to leave. Opportunities like this don't wait indefinitely, and circumstances can change quickly when you're carrying unsustainable overhead. After Bob's sedan disappeared down the driveway, an uncomfortable silence settled over the house. Will stood at the window watching the dust settle, his expression unreadable. Kate busied herself clearing away the coffee cups and papers, unsure of what to say. I'm sorry you had to witness that, Will said finally. Are the things he said about the ranch's finances true? Kate asked directly. Are you struggling financially? Will turned from the window, his expression troubled. Ranching is always a challenging business. We have good years and bad years. This year has been particularly difficult because of drought conditions and feed costs. So you can't afford to employ me. Kate, that's not what this is about, isn't it? Kate faced him directly. If every dollar matters, then my salary is money you could be saving for the boys' future. Will was quiet for a long moment, and Kate could see him weighing his words carefully. The boys' future isn't just about money, Kate. It's about the kind of men they become, the values they learn, the stability they have while they're growing up. But Bob's right about one thing. I'm additional overhead you didn't have before. You're also the reason my sons are happy and healthy for the first time in 2 years. Will said firmly. You're the reason I can sleep at night knowing they're cared for properly. You're the reason this house feels like a home again instead of just a place where we exist. The intensity in his voice caught Kate off guard. She could see the conflict in his expression, the struggle between practical concerns and deeper needs. What aren't you telling me, Will? He sighed heavily, moving to sit at the kitchen table. Bob's not wrong about the financial pressures. We've had 2 bad years in a row, and some of our operating loans are coming due. I've been managing, but it's been tight. Kate felt her heart sink. So you really can't afford me. I can afford you if I'm careful about other expenses. What I can't afford is to lose you. The boys need you, Kate. I need you. The simple admission hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was ready to address directly. Kate felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, quickly followed by the practical reality of their situation. But if things get worse financially, then we'll figure it out together. I'm not making decisions based on Bob's fears or his development schemes. Before Kate could respond, Tommy and Jake burst through the back door, their clothes dirty and their faces bright with excitement. Kate, you have to come see our fort. We figured out how to make a pulley system for bringing supplies up to the loft. The boys' enthusiasm was infectious, and Kate felt some of the tension from the afternoon begin to ease. Whatever complications Bob Harrison had introduced, the fundamental reason she was here remained unchanged. These children needed her, and she was beginning to realize that she needed them just as much. "Show me everything," she said, allowing herself to be pulled toward the barn by two excited boys. As they walked across the yard, Kate caught Will watching them from the kitchen window, his expression soft with something that looked like contentment despite the day's stresses. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. And for the first time since David's death, Kate felt like she was part of something worth fighting for. The fort Tommy and Jake had constructed was an impressive feat of childhood engineering. They'd used hay bales, old lumber, and salvaged materials to create a multi-level structure complete with the pulley system Tommy had mentioned. Kate was genuinely impressed by their ingenuity and teamwork. "This is incredible," she told them, examining their construction with the same attention she'd once given to complex dress designs. "You've really thought through the structural elements." Both boys beamed with pride, and Jake actually spoke up to explain how they'd solved the problem of getting materials to the upper level without a ladder. As the afternoon wore on, Kate found herself relaxing into the rhythm of ranch life once again. The boys' simple joy in their project was infectious, and their easy acceptance of her as part of their world continued to amaze her. But beneath the surface calm, she couldn't shake the implications of Bob's visit. Financial pressures, family conflict, and questions about her own role in the household's future all swirled in her mind. She was walking a tightrope between being genuinely helpful and being an unaffordable luxury, and the balance felt increasingly precarious. When Will joined them in the barn as evening approached, Kate noticed the stress lines around his eyes had eased somewhat. The boys immediately enlisted him in their fort project, and soon all four of them were working together to add a rope ladder to the structure. "Dad, can Kate stay for dinner and help us make that pasta she taught us yesterday?" Tommy asked, as they worked. "If Kate wants to," Will replied, his gaze meeting hers over the boys' heads. Kate nodded, recognizing the question behind the question. Despite Bob's visit and the uncertainties it had raised, Will was asking her to stay, to continue being part of their daily life. "I'd love to," she said simply. As they walked back to the house together, the boys running ahead to wash up, Will fell into step beside her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not letting Bob's visit change anything. For staying." Kate felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "This is where I belong right now," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Will's smile was soft and genuine. "I'm glad you feel that way." As they entered the house and began the familiar rhythm of preparing dinner together, Kate reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She'd found more than employment here. She'd found purpose, connection, and the beginning of something that felt remarkably like home. Whatever challenges Bob Harrison and his development schemes might bring, Kate was no longer the desperate woman who'd answered a help-wanted ad. She was part of a family now, with all the complications and responsibilities that entailed. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was exactly where she wanted to be. The morning Kate discovered the truth about her connection to the Harrison family began like any other. She was in the sewing room, carefully altering a pair of Jake's school pants while he watched with his usual fascination, when Tommy burst through the door with an old shoebox clutched in his arms. "Kate, look what I found in the attic. It's full of Mom's old stuff that Dad packed away." Tommy's excitement was infectious as he set the box on her work table, completely oblivious to the way Jake immediately tensed at the mention of their mother's belongings. Will appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting to concern when he saw the box. "Tommy, I've told you that attic is off limits. Those boxes contain things that are too fragile for." "It's okay, Dad. I was just looking for extra blankets for the fort, and this one was already open. Look, there are pictures and letters and all kinds of cool stuff." Kate noticed Jake had gone completely still, his small hands clenched in his lap as he stared at the box with a mixture of longing and fear. The child's reaction tugged at her heart, and she set down her sewing to give him her full attention. "Would you like to look at some of your mom's things, Jake?" she asked gently. "Sometimes it helps to remember the happy times." Jake shook his head quickly, but his eyes remained fixed on the box. Kate recognized the internal conflict he was experiencing. wanting to connect with memories of his mother while simultaneously being afraid of the pain those memories might bring. Will moved into the room, his own expression troubled. Maybe we should put this away for now. When you're both older. No, Dad, Tommy interrupted, his voice unusually serious. We're not babies anymore. And Kate's right. We should remember the happy stuff about Mom. Before anyone could object, Tommy had opened the box and begun carefully removing its contents. There were photographs, letters tied with ribbon, a small jewelry box, and what appeared to be a handmade baby blanket. But it was the manila folder at the bottom of the box that caught Kate's attention. What's in there? Tommy asked, noticing her gaze. Will reached for the folder quickly, but Tommy was faster. The papers scattered across Kate's work table, and suddenly she was staring at documents that made her blood run cold. Legal papers, business contracts, and at the top of the pile, a partnership agreement between William Harrison and David Mitchell for something called Rocky Mountain Livestock Ventures. Kate's vision blurred as she stared at her late husband's signature on the contract. David Mitchell. Her David. The man she'd been married to for 8 years. The man she'd thought she knew everything about had been Will's business partner. Kate. Will's voice seemed to come from very far away. Kate, are you all right? She looked up to find all three of them staring at her with concern. Tommy was holding a photograph of a man she recognized all too well. David, standing next to Will, and a beautiful woman who must have been Maggie. All of them laughing at some long ago gathering. You knew my husband, Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. Will's face had gone pale, and she could see the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes. Catherine Mitchell, he said slowly. David's wife. I should have realized when you said your last name was Mitchell, but Catherine is such a common name, and you said you were from Chicago. David told me he had a business partner in Montana. Kate said, her mind racing as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. Someone he'd met in college who shared his dream of raising premium cattle. But he never mentioned your name. He just called you his Montana partner. Tommy and Jake were looking back and forth between the adults, clearly sensing the significance of the moment even if they didn't understand it completely. David was our friend, Tommy said uncertainly. Mom used to talk about him sometimes. She said he was really smart about cattle genetics. Kate felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her husband had been part of the Harrison family's life, had known Will's wife, had been present for family gatherings, had been someone Maggie talked about to her children. He's in lots of pictures, Jake whispered, speaking up for the first time since the box had been opened. Mom said he made Dad laugh a lot. Will ran a hand through his hair, his expression tormented. Kate, I had no idea. When you showed up here looking for work, if I had known you were David's widow, what would you have done differently? Kate asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. I don't know, Will admitted honestly. The whole situation would have been too complicated, too painful. Kate stared at the scattered papers, trying to process the implications of what she'd discovered. Is that why you were so willing to hire me? Some kind of guilt about David? No, Will said firmly. I hired you because you were exactly what my boys needed. The connection to David was completely unknown to me until this moment. Kate picked up one of the photographs, studying David's face. He looked younger than she remembered him, happier and more carefree. In the picture, he had his arm around Will's shoulders while Maggie laughed at something one of them had said. Tell me about him, she said quietly. Tell me about the David you knew. Will seemed surprised by the request, but after a moment he pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. Tommy and Jake moved closer, sensing story time. David was brilliant, Will began slowly. Not just smart, but truly brilliant when it came to understanding cattle genetics and breeding programs. He had ideas about crossbreeding that were years ahead of their time. Kate nodded, recognizing the passionate, innovative man she'd fallen in love with. But more than that, he was one of the most genuinely decent people I've ever known. He cared about the animals, about sustainable ranching practices, about doing things the right way even when it was harder or more expensive. He sounds like someone Mom would have liked, Tommy observed. She adored him, Will confirmed. David had this way of making everyone around him feel smarter and more capable. He believed in people, encouraged them to reach for bigger goals. Kate felt tears prick her eyes. This was indeed the David she remembered, but hearing about him from someone else's perspective felt like discovering a new facet of a precious gem. What happened to the business partnership? She asked. Will's expression grew troubled. David wanted to expand faster than I thought was prudent. He had grand visions of building a genetics program that would revolutionize cattle ranching in the western states. I was more conservative, more focused on steady growth. Kate could see the conflict developing. David had always been a dreamer, someone who thought big and moved fast. Will was clearly more methodical, more careful. We disagreed about taking on debt to finance the expansion. David thought the potential returns justified the risk. I worried about overextending ourselves financially. The familiar pattern made Kate's heart ache. This was exactly the kind of visionary thinking that had made David so successful in their wedding dress business, but also the kind of risk-taking that had sometimes kept her awake at night. So you ended the partnership. We agreed to dissolve the business arrangement amicably. David took his share of the assets and moved back to Chicago to pursue other opportunities. We stayed in touch for a while, but eventually lost contact. Kate was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information about her husband's past. There had been a whole chapter of his life, a whole relationship and business venture, that he'd never fully shared with her. Were you angry with him? She asked. For wanting to expand so aggressively. Will considered the question carefully. Not angry. Disappointed maybe. I thought we made a good team, and I was sorry to see the partnership end. But I understood that we had different visions for the future. Mom said David sent Christmas cards for a few years. Tommy added helpfully. With pictures of his wedding and stuff. The casual mention of her own wedding photos being shared with this family years ago felt surreal. David had maintained a connection to the Harrisons that she'd known nothing about. Why didn't David ever tell me the details about your partnership? Kate asked. He mentioned having a business partner in Montana, but he never talked about what happened or why it ended. Probably because he knew you'd worry about him making the same mistakes again. Will suggested gently. David was the kind of man who learned from his experiences. But he didn't dwell on disappointments. The insight rang true. David had indeed been someone who looked forward rather than backward, who preferred to focus on new opportunities rather than past setbacks. Jake, who had been silently absorbing the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. Is that why Kate came here? Because of David? The innocent question hung in the air, highlighting the complexity of the situation. Kate had come to Montana seeking employment, but fate had led her to the one place where her husband's memory was preserved in the hearts of people who had cared about him. I think, Will said slowly, that sometimes life has a way of bringing people together when they need each other most, even if the connections run deeper than we initially realize. Kate looked around the table at the three faces watching her expectantly. Tommy's expression was bright with curiosity, Jake's was solemn but trusting, and Will's was filled with a complicated mixture of concern and something that might have been hope. What does this change? She asked, quietly. Nothing, Will said firmly. And everything. Nothing about why you're here or what you mean to this family has changed. But everything about our history together is more complex than any of us realized. Over the following days, Kate found herself viewing her relationship with the Harrison family through an entirely new lens. Every conversation with Will carried the weight of their shared connection to David. Every moment of domesticity felt both more natural and more complicated. The boys, with the adaptability of children, had quickly integrated the knowledge of Kate's connection to their parents' friend into their understanding of family dynamics. For them, it simply made sense that someone David had cared about would end up caring for them. But Kate struggled with the implications of her discovery. Had she unconsciously sought out the Harrison family because of some buried memory of David mentioning his Montana partner? Was her growing attachment to Will and the boys genuine, or was it somehow connected to her grief for her husband? The questions tormented her until the afternoon she found Will in the barn, struggling to repair a complex piece of equipment while cursing under his breath. "Need help?" she offered. "Unless you know anything about hydraulic systems, probably not," Will replied, but his tone was more frustrated than dismissive. Kate studied the machinery for a moment. "David used to work on equipment like this. He taught me a few things about troubleshooting hydraulic problems." Will looked up with surprise. "Really?" He said. "Every ranch wife should understand the basics of machinery repair, since breakdowns always happened at the worst possible times." Together they worked through the problems systematically, with Kate drawing on half-remembered lessons from her husband while Will provided the ranch-specific knowledge. When they finally got the equipment running smoothly, both of them were dirty, tired, and oddly exhilarated. "David was right about the timing," Will observed, washing his hands at the barn sink. "This thing always breaks down during the busiest season." "He was right about a lot of things," Kate said softly. Will studied her expression carefully. "Are you okay with all of this? Learning about David's connection to our family?" Kate considered the question seriously. "I think I'm grateful for it. It helps me understand why I felt so comfortable here so quickly. There was already a connection, even if I didn't know it consciously, and it doesn't make you want to leave. To find somewhere without so many complicated memories." The question revealed Will's deeper fear, that learning about David's history with the Harrison family would drive Kate away, would make her position too emotionally complex to sustain. "Will, David's been gone for over a year. The memories I have of him are precious, but they belong to my past. What I'm building here with you and the boys belongs to my future." The relief in Will's expression was immediate and profound. "I was afraid that knowing about David would change everything between us." "It does change things," Kate admitted, "but not in the way you're worried about. It makes me feel like I'm supposed to be here. Like David somehow knew I'd need this family eventually." Before Will could respond, the sound of raised voices from the direction of the house interrupted their conversation. Through the barn door, they could see Bob Harrison's sedan in the driveway, and the man himself standing on the front porch in heated discussion with someone Kate couldn't see. "Stay here," Will said grimly, but Kate was already following him toward the house. Bob's voice carried clearly across the yard. "This arrangement has gone on long enough. Will, it's time to face reality about your financial situation and make some adult decisions." "My decisions are none of your business," Bob came Will's firm reply, though Kate realized the voice was actually coming from Tommy, who had apparently answered the door. "Don't be ridiculous, boy. Go get your father. This is adult business." Kate felt her temper flare at Bob's dismissive tone toward Tommy, but Will's hand on her arm reminded her to let him handle his brother. "I'm right here," Will called out as they approached the house. "What's so urgent that you couldn't call first?" Bob turned with obvious relief, though his expression darkened when he saw Kate walking beside Will. "We need to talk privately about the Pinnacle development offer. They've sweetened the terms considerably. And I've told you repeatedly that I'm not interested in any terms." "Will, be reasonable. You can't afford to turn down this kind of money, especially not with your current overhead situation." Bob's pointed glance toward Kate made his meaning clear. Once again, he was implying that Will's employment of her was financially irresponsible. "My overhead situation is manageable," Will replied coldly. "Is it? Because I've been doing some research into your recent expenses and the numbers don't support your optimism." Kate felt a chill run down her spine. Bob's tone suggested he had specific information about the ranch's finances, information that went beyond casual family concern. "What kind of research?" Will asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The kind that business partners have a right to conduct when they're concerned about joint investments and co-signed loans. The implication hit Kate like a physical blow. Bob wasn't just Will's brother. He was apparently also involved in the ranch's financial structure in ways that gave him access to confidential information. You've been investigating my personal finances. Will's anger was building, but Kate could see him trying to control it in front of the boys. I've been protecting my own interests, Bob replied unapologetically. And what I've found is that you're carrying unsustainable debt, making questionable expenditures, and generally mismanaging resources that affect more than just your own family. Kate stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. Mr. Harrison, I think you should leave. This conversation is inappropriate, especially in front of the children. Bob's smile was cold and calculating. Miss Mitchell, how convenient that you're here. I was hoping to speak with you as well. About what? About your real reason for being in Montana. About your connection to David Mitchell and the unresolved financial obligations from his partnership with my brother. Kate felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What are you talking about? David Mitchell left significant debts when he dissolved his partnership with Will. Debts that were never fully resolved. As his widow, you might be interested to know that those obligations could still be collected. Will stepped between Kate and his brother, his expression furious. That's enough, Bob. David's debts were settled years ago. You have no legal standing to pursue anything related to his estate. Are you sure about that? Bob pulled a folder from his briefcase, the same kind of legal documents that had started this whole revelation. Because my attorneys seem to think there are some interesting questions about asset transfers and debt assumptions that were never properly documented. Kate stared at the papers, her mind racing. David had never mentioned ongoing obligations to Will or unresolved business debts. But then again, he'd never mentioned many details about his Montana partnership. What exactly are you implying? She asked, though she was afraid she already knew. I'm suggesting that your presence here might not be as coincidental as it appears. That perhaps you sought out Will specifically because of the unresolved financial connections between our families. The accusation was ugly and completely false. But Kate could see how someone might construct such a narrative. A widow with financial problems, seeking out her late husband's former business partner could indeed look suspicious to a cynical observer. That's absurd, Will said firmly. Kate had no idea about my connection to David when she answered my job advertisement. So she claims, Bob replied smoothly. But it would be quite a coincidence, wouldn't it? A woman with David Mitchell's last name just happening to show up looking for work at the ranch where her husband was once a partner. Kate felt sick as she realized how easily her genuine need for employment could be twisted into something calculating and mercenary. Bob was constructing a narrative that made her look like a gold digger who had manipulated her way into the Harrison family's life. Get off my property, Will said, his voice deadly quiet. Now, Will, I'm trying to help you see the situation clearly. This woman has inserted herself into your household under false pretenses. She's influencing your business decisions, encouraging you to reject profitable opportunities, and generally manipulating. Will's movement was so fast that Kate barely saw it. One moment Bob was speaking, the next he was backing away from his brother's advancing form, his confident demeanor finally cracking. I said get off my property. If you come back here with any more of these accusations or legal threats, we'll settle this in a way you won't like. Bob gathered his papers hastily, his corporate polish finally showing cracks. You're making a mistake, Will. A mistake that's going to cost you everything you've worked for. The only mistake I made was trusting my brother to act with basic decency, Will replied. After Bob's sedan disappeared down the driveway, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Tommy and Jake stood close together, clearly shaken by the adult's argument. Kate felt like she might be sick. Is any of what he said true? She asked quietly. About David's debts or unresolved obligations. Will was quiet for a long moment, his expression troubled. There were some complicated aspects to our partnership dissolution. David wanted to pursue opportunities that required more capital than we had available. When we agreed to split our assets, there were some loans that weren't immediately transferable. Kate's heart sank. So there were ongoing financial obligations. Nothing that wasn't eventually resolved, Will said firmly. Bob is twisting legitimate business complexities into something sinister because he wants to discredit you and pressure me into selling the ranch. But he's right about one thing, Kate said miserably. My showing up here does look suspicious when you add in the David connection. Only to someone who's looking for reasons to be suspicious, Will countered. Kate, you had no way of knowing about David's history with our family when you answered that job advertisement. The connection is a coincidence, nothing more. Is it? Kate asked, doubt creeping into her voice. Maybe subconsciously, I remembered David mentioning his Montana partner. Maybe I was drawn here for reasons I didn't understand at the time. Even if that were true, it doesn't change anything about who you are or what you've meant to this family. Tommy and Jake had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, and finally Tommy spoke up. Are you going to leave because of Uncle Bob? The direct question from a child cut straight to the heart of the matter. Kate looked at Tommy's worried face, at Jake's silent fear, at Will's carefully controlled expression. I don't know, she admitted. Honestly, this changes things in ways I'm still trying to understand. Please don't go, Jake whispered, his small voice breaking Kate's heart. We need you. The simple plea from a child who rarely spoke above a whisper was almost Kate's undoing. She knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in hers. Jake, I care about you and Tommy and your dad more than I can express. But sometimes caring about someone means making sure you're not causing them problems. You're not causing problems, Tommy said fiercely. Uncle Bob is. He's the one who's being mean and saying ugly things. Will crouched down beside Kate, addressing both boys directly. This is complicated adult stuff that you shouldn't have to worry about. Kate and I need to figure some things out, but whatever happens, it won't change how much we all care about each other. That evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Kate and Will sat on the back porch in the gathering darkness. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts and complicated emotions. What are you thinking? Will asked finally. I'm thinking that Bob might be right about some things, Kate said quietly. Not about my motives, but about the appearance of the situation. My presence here does complicate your life in ways you don't need. Kate, you've been the best thing to happen to this family in 2 years. I'm not going to let Bob's paranoia and greed drive you away. But what if he's right about the financial pressures? What if employing me really is an expense you can't afford? Will was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. The ranch is facing some financial challenges. 2 bad years, some equipment problems, rising costs. But we're not in immediate danger, and we're certainly not in a position where your salary is the deciding factor between success and failure. Yet Bob seems to think my presence is influencing your business decisions. Bob thinks anyone who doesn't prioritize profit above everything else is a bad influence. Will replied with obvious frustration. He's never understood that this ranch is about more than money. Kate turned to face him in the darkness. Will, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be completely honest with me. All right, are you keeping me here partly because of guilt about David? Because you feel like you owe his widow something? The question hung in the air between them for a long moment. Kate could see Will struggling with his answer, and that struggle told her more than his words might. At first, he said finally, when I realized who you were, there might have been an element of that. David was a good man, and the thought that his widow was struggling while I had the means to help. Yes, that influenced my thinking. Kate felt her heart sink, even though she'd expected this answer. But that's not why I want you to stay now, Will continued urgently. Kate, look at me. She turned to meet his gaze in the dim light. I want you to stay because Tommy laughs again. Because Jake talks to you. Because this house feels alive when you're in it. Because you've become essential to my children's happiness and to my own peace of mind. The intensity in his voice caught Kate off guard. She could see the truth of his feelings in his expression, the genuine emotion behind his words. I want you to stay because somewhere along the way, you stopped being just the housekeeper and became part of our family. Because I've fallen in love with the woman who fixes my son's clothes and teaches them to cook and handles their grief with such patience and wisdom. Kate's breath caught in her throat. Will, I know it's complicated. I know the timing isn't ideal and the circumstances are messy. But I love you, Kate. Not because of David, not because of guilt or obligation, but because of who you are and what you've brought into our lives. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and completely unexpected. Kate felt tears prick her eyes as she processed the magnitude of what he'd just said. "I love you too," she whispered, the words coming from a place of absolute certainty she hadn't known existed. "I love your boys. I love this place. I love the life we've built together." "Then stay," Will said simply. "Whatever Bob throws at us, whatever complications arise, we'll face them together. As a family." Kate thought about Bob's threats, about the financial pressures, about the complicated history that connected her to this family through David's memory. Then she thought about Tommy's laugh, Jake's growing confidence, Will's steady strength, and the sense of belonging she'd found here. "Yes," she said finally. "I'll stay." Will's kiss was gentle and tentative at first, then deeper as Kate responded with her own certainty. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling through tears. "There's one more thing we need to settle," Kate said, her voice lighter than it had been all day. "What's that?" "Bob's legal threats about David's debts. If there really are unresolved financial obligations, I want to know about them. I want to help resolve them if I can." Will shook his head. "Kate, David's debts aren't your responsibility. They are if they're affecting your ranch and your family's security. We're partners now, Will. That means we share both the joys and the burdens." The word partners seemed to resonate between them, carrying implications far beyond business arrangements or household management. 6 months later, Kate stood in the same sewing room where she'd first discovered her connection to the Harrison family, putting the finishing touches on a very different kind of garment than she'd ever created before. Tommy's suit for his middle school graduation was simple compared to the elaborate wedding gowns she'd once designed, but the care and love she'd put into every stitch made it far more meaningful. Bob's legal threats had proven to be mostly bluster, though there had been some legitimate financial loose ends from David's partnership that Kate and Will had worked together to resolve. The process had actually strengthened their relationship, proving that they could handle complicated challenges as a team. The ranch was slowly recovering from its financial difficulties, helped by a good year weather-wise and some innovative marketing strategies that combined Will's practical knowledge with Kate's design sensibilities. They'd started a small side business creating custom leather goods that showcased both the ranch's heritage and Kate's attention to detail. "Kate," Jake's voice called from the kitchen. "Dad says it's time for lunch." Jake's voice had grown stronger and more confident over the months, though he still reserved his most important conversations for Kate. His selective mutism had largely resolved as his sense of security had strengthened. "Coming." Kate called back, hanging up Tommy's completed suit and heading toward the sounds of family life. She found Will and the boys in the kitchen, working together to prepare sandwiches for lunch. The easy teamwork between them never failed to warm her heart. This was what family looked like. Not perfect, but loving and supportive and real. "How's the suit coming along?" Will asked, slipping an arm around her waist as she joined them at the counter. "Finished. Tommy's going to look very handsome at graduation." Tommy beamed with pride. He'd grown several inches over the winter and was beginning to show glimpses of the man he would become. The angry, grieving boy Kate had first met was still there sometimes, but increasingly he was overshadowed by confidence and hope. "Can I see it?" Tommy asked eagerly. "After lunch. I want to check the fit one more time." As they sat around the kitchen table sharing their simple meal, Kate reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this place. She'd come to Montana seeking employment and found a family. She'd discovered connections to her past that helped her understand her future. She'd learned that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances. "Dad," Jake said suddenly, his voice serious in the way that indicated an important announcement was coming. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, buddy?" "I think we should ask Kate to marry us. All of us, I mean. As a family." The innocent suggestion from an 8-year-old hit the table like a small bomb. Kate felt her cheeks flush as she met Will's surprised gaze across the table. "Jake," Tommy said with the worldly wisdom of a 12-year-old, "that's not how marriage works. Dad would marry Kate, and then she'd be our stepmom." "I know that," Jake replied with dignity. But I think we should all ask her together, since we all want her to stay forever. Will reached across the table to take Kate's hand, his expression soft with love and amazement. What do you think, Kate? Would you consider a proposal from all three Harrison men? Kate looked around the table at the three faces watching her expectantly. Tommy's expression was bright with excitement. Jake's was solemn but hopeful, and Will's was filled with love and quiet certainty. I think, she said carefully, that would be the most beautiful proposal a woman could ever receive. Will's smile was radiant as he squeezed her hand. Then consider this our official request. Kate Mitchell, would you do us the honor of becoming a permanent member of the Harrison family? Yes, Kate said without hesitation. Yes to all of you. The celebration that followed was loud and joyful and perfectly chaotic, with both boys talking excitedly about wedding plans and family, while Will held Kate close and whispered promises about their future together. As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, illuminating the scene of domestic happiness, Kate felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected paths that had led her here. She'd come to Montana as a desperate woman fleeing a failed life. She was staying as a beloved wife and mother, surrounded by the family she'd never known she was looking for. David would have approved, she thought. He'd always believed that love found a way to bloom in the most unlikely places, that families could be built from the most unexpected circumstances. And perhaps, in some cosmic way, his memory had guided her to the place where she belonged. Later that evening, as she tucked Jake into bed with his beloved elephant and listened to Tommy's excited chatter about their upcoming family expansion, Kate realized that her journey was complete. She'd found more than employment or even love. She'd found home. 1 year later, Kate Harrison stood at the altar of the small church in Cedar Falls, adjusting the boutonniere on Jake's suit with the same careful attention she'd once given to couture wedding gowns. The irony wasn't lost on her that after years of creating dreams for other brides, she was finally living her own fairy tale. The church was filled with friends and neighbors from the ranching community, people who had welcomed Kate into their tight-knit world with surprising warmth. Mrs. Peterson from the fabric store sat next to Dr. Carter, while Pete and Miguel occupied an entire pew with their extended families. Even Jim Carson had closed the bank early to attend the ceremony that had become the talk of Sunset Valley. Tommy stood beside his father at the altar, looking remarkably mature in his role as best man. The angry, grieving boy Kate had first encountered had grown into a confident young man who'd taken on the responsibility of helping plan the wedding with impressive attention to detail. He'd insisted on personally reviewing the flower arrangements and had worked with Kate to design custom napkins featuring the ranch's horseshoe logo. Jake fidgeted beside his brother, clutching the ring pillow with white-knuckled determination. His selective mutism was now just a memory, replaced by an 8-year-old's enthusiasm for life and an unshakable confidence in his place within the family. He'd been practicing his wedding duties for weeks, taking his role as ring-bearer as seriously as a sacred trust. Will waited at the altar with an expression of quiet joy that took Kate's breath away. The man who had once seemed carved from the harsh Montana landscape now radiated a contentment that transformed his weathered features. The stress lines around his eyes had softened over the past year, replaced by laugh lines earned through countless evenings of family dinners and weekend adventures. The simple wedding dress Kate had created for herself was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Made from ivory silk that caught the afternoon light streaming through the church's stained glass windows, it featured hand-sewn pearl buttons down the back and delicate lace sleeves that she'd crafted during quiet evening hours while the boys did homework. The dress was a testament to her skills, but more importantly, it was a symbol of the new life she was embracing. As the organ began the processional music, Kate took a deep breath and began her walk down the aisle. She'd chosen to walk alone, carrying a bouquet of wild flowers, picked that morning from the ranch's meadows. The gesture felt right. She was choosing this family, this life, this future with complete independence and absolute certainty. Will's eyes never left her face as she approached, and Kate could see the love and gratitude shining in his expression. They'd weathered storms together over the past year, both literal and metaphorical, and emerged stronger as a unit. The financial pressures that had once seemed so overwhelming had been resolved through careful planning and hard work. The ranch was thriving, their leather goods business was gaining recognition throughout the region, and the boys were flourishing in ways that sometimes amazed their father. When Kate reached the altar and took Will's outstretched hand, Pastor Williams smiled warmly at the assembled family. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today not just to witness the union of Will and Kate, but to celebrate the formation of a family that has already proven its strength through love, commitment, and shared purpose." The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. Kate and Will had written their own vows, promising not just to love and cherish each other, but to continue building the family they'd created together. Tommy and Jake participated in the ring exchange, their serious faces reflecting the importance they placed on this moment that would officially make Kate their stepmother. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender and full of promise. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, but Kate was only aware of Will's arms around her and the beaming faces of her new sons. The reception was held in the church's fellowship hall, decorated with sunflowers and white roses that complemented the rustic elegance Kate had envisioned. The cake, a three-tiered vanilla confection with buttercream frosting, had been made by Mrs. Henderson from the local bakery, who'd insisted on donating her services as a wedding gift to the family that had become so beloved in the community. During the dinner, toast after toast celebrated not just the marriage, but the remarkable transformation everyone had witnessed in the Harrison family. Dr. Carter spoke about watching the boys bloom under Kate's patient care. Pete and Miguel shared stories about Will's renewed energy and optimism in running the ranch. Mrs. Peterson tearfully described watching Kate transform from a desperate stranger into the heart of a loving family. But it was Tommy's toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Standing with surprising poise for a 13-year-old, he raised his glass of apple cider and cleared his throat. "A year ago, my dad put an ad in the paper looking for someone to help take care of me and Jake. He thought he was just hiring a housekeeper who could sew. But Kate didn't just fix our clothes, she fixed our family. She taught us that it's okay to miss mom, while still being happy about new people who come into our lives. She showed us that love doesn't run out when you share it with more people. And she proved that sometimes the best things happen when you're not looking for them." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Kate had to wipe away tears before she could respond. When the noise died down, she stood beside Tommy, her arm around his shoulders. "Tommy and Jake, you taught me something equally important. You showed me that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who choose to love and support each other every single day. You welcomed a stranger into your home and made her feel like she belonged. You were patient with my mistakes, generous with your trust, and brave enough to open your hearts again after experiencing such loss." She turned to Will, her voice thick with emotion. "And you, Will Harrison, gave me more than just a job. You gave me a purpose, a place to belong, and a love I never thought I'd find again. You trusted me with your most precious possessions, your sons. And you taught me that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest acts of faith." The dancing that followed was joyful and uninhibited. Will proved to be a surprisingly skilled dancer, guiding Kate through waltzes and two-steps with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything else. Tommy and Jake took turns dancing with their new stepmother, both boys glowing with pride and happiness. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Kate found herself standing on the church steps with her new family, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and purple. The familiar landscape that had once seemed alien now felt like the most natural backdrop for her life. "Happy?" Will asked quietly, slipping his arm around her waist. Completely, Kate replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Dad, can we go home now? Jake asked, tugging on Will's jacket. I want to show Kate the surprise we made for her. The drive back to the ranch was filled with excited chatter from the boys about the surprise they'd been planning for weeks. Kate had strict instructions to close her eyes as they approached the house, with Tommy and Jake providing dramatic warnings about peeking. When they finally allowed her to look, Kate gasped with delight. The front porch of the ranch house had been decorated with white lights and flowing ribbons. But it was the large wooden sign hanging above the door that took her breath away. Hand-carved and painted with loving care, it read, "The Harrison Family. Will, Kate, Tommy, and Jake." "We made it in woodshop class," Tommy explained proudly. "Mr. Peterson helped us with the carving, but we did all the painting ourselves." "It's perfect," Kate whispered, tears threatening again. "Absolutely perfect." As they entered the house that was now officially her home, Kate marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The rooms that had once felt like foreign territory now welcomed her with familiar comfort. Her sewing room was established as her creative sanctuary. The kitchen reflected her influence in its organization and warmth. And everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of the life they'd built together. Later that night, after the boys had finally been convinced to go to bed despite their excitement, Kate and Will sat on their back porch, as they had so many times before. But tonight was different. Tonight they were husband and wife, officially united in their commitment to each other and to the family they'd created. "Any regrets?" Will asked, echoing a question they'd asked each other many times over the past year. "Only one," Kate replied with a smile. "I wish I'd answered your job advertisements sooner." Will laughed, pulling her closer on the porch swing they'd installed the previous spring. "I have a feeling you arrived exactly when you were supposed to. When we were all ready for you." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and watching stars appear in the vast Montana sky. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, and somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered. These sounds that had once been foreign to Kate now formed a comforting soundtrack of home. "What do you think David would say about all this?" Will asked quietly, broaching a subject they rarely discussed, but both thought about. Kate considered the question seriously. "I think he'd be happy that his two favorite people found each other. David always believed that love was meant to be shared, that joy multiplied when it was given away. He'd probably say it took us long enough to figure it out." Will nodded, understanding flowing between them. David's memory was part of their foundation, but it didn't define their future. They'd honored the past while building something entirely new and uniquely their own. "The boys are going to be impossible to live with for the next few weeks," Will observed with fond exasperation. "They've been planning this wedding like military strategists." "They've been perfect," Kate said firmly. "Patient, helpful, excited about the changes. Not every child would have been so welcoming to a stepmother." "They knew what they needed before I did," Will admitted. "Tommy told me months ago that you were going to marry us. He said it was obvious to everyone except the adults." Kate laughed, remembering similar pronouncements from both boys over the past year. Their certainty about the rightness of the family they were creating had often surpassed that of the adults involved. As the night deepened around them, Kate reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd left Chicago as a broken woman fleeing the ruins of her former life. She'd arrived in Montana as a desperate job seeker with nowhere else to turn. But somewhere along the way, she'd discovered that endings could become beginnings, that loss could lead to unexpected joy, and that family could be found in the most unlikely places. The ranch spread out before them in the darkness, 15,000 acres of rolling pasture, an endless possibility. This land that had sustained 4 generations of Harrisons would now sustain her as well, providing not just a home but a legacy to pass on to Tommy and Jake. "Ready to go inside, Mrs. Harrison?" Will asked, using her new name with obvious pleasure. "Ready," Kate replied, standing and taking his hand. As they walked into their home together, Kate felt a profound sense of completion. She'd found her place in the world, her purpose, her family. The seamstress who had once created dreams for other women had finally stepped into her own. Happily ever after. Behind them, the Montana night settled over the ranch with gentle finality. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to strengthen the bonds they'd forged. But tonight was perfect in its simplicity. A family united, a home filled with love, and a future bright with promise. In the end, the job advertisement that had started it all had been misleading. Will Harrison hadn't really needed a seamstress and a mother for his boys. He'd needed a partner to help him rebuild his life, someone to share the burdens and multiply the joys. And Kate had needed exactly the same thing. Together, they'd discovered that the best kind of mending wasn't done with needle and thread, but with patience, love, and the courage to trust again. They'd learned that family wasn't defined by blood or law, but by the daily choice to care for each other through whatever life might bring. As the lights went out in the Harrison Ranch house, 4 hearts beat in harmony under the vast Montana sky. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, new reasons to be grateful for the unexpected paths that had led them all home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.